Hello and welcome back to my channel. Now, I know I can't be the only person who spent this Christmas watching the old BBC Ghost Stories for Christmas repeats on Talking Pictures. They showed all of them, didn't they? Now, I loved these as a child, and they were a special part of Christmas for me. For those people who don't know, they were a series of like half-hour, 50-minute ghost stories that were usually shown on Christmas Eve by the BBC, usually adaptations of M.R. James stories. And they used to terrify me at Christmas. They were a special Christmas treat. They started unofficially in 1968 when Jonathan Miller, who was a sort of British polymath, he was a qualified brain surgeon. He was also a writer, a comedian. He was in Beyond the Fringe with Alan Bennett and Peter Cook and Dudley Moore. And he went on to become a famous and much garlanded opera director. But in his spare time, he turned up to this BBC Arts programme, Omnibus, and he made an adaptation of M.R. James's story, Oh Whistle and I'll Come to You, My Lad. And this has become a kind of cult classic in Britain, a cult horror classic. 3 years later, a guy called Lawrence Gordon Clark went to the BBC to ask to make another adaptation of M.R. James. He thought it would be a nice tradition to start this at Christmas time. He was both the producer, the adapter and the director. And he made The Stalls of Barchester Cathedral in 1971. And this was the first, and every year from that point, they made a ghost story for Christmas, usually on Christmas Eve. He made 5 adaptations of M.R. James, then he did a Dickens adaptation, and then he did 2 modern ghost stories, right? And those films, those little TV films, are as important to me as the films of any other director. I watched them when I was a kid. They had a huge impact on my imagination. I loved their style, the way they looked, their creepy texture and atmosphere. And I can honestly say that Lawrence Gordon Clark as a director influenced me as much as anyone I can think of. But they came to an end in about 1978. Interestingly, you may not know this, but the next year, a guy called Leslie Megahy, who was one of the editors of Omnibus, again, the arts programme, kind of tried to revive them. And he made a movie called Shalken the Painter. I'm also going to include that on my list. I will also include the Jonathan Miller on my list. The original 70s run is collected on these 2 beautiful BFI box sets. I got the second one, this one, for Christmas. So I'm going to do a ranking of all of the Lawrence Gordon Clark stories, plus the 2 omnibuses that bookend the series. Before I go into it, they have tried to revive the series in recent years with very mixed results. I mean, God, did you see that latest Mark Gatiss one at Christmas, Lot 249? Bloody awful. It just shows you how the BBC can't do period anymore, and they can't do effective suspense or texture anymore. It's all very meta and knowing. Dreadful, absolutely dreadful. The best of the later ones is A View from a Hill, which is also based on an M.R. James story. It's got quite a nice conceit of this guy who finds these binoculars, and if you spread this kind of this unguent on them, you can see this ancient cathedral which used to lie in the countryside. That one's probably the best of the modern ones, but I'm not going to include the modern ones in these rankings. Just before I get into the ranking, there are 2 ghost story films from Britain in the 70s which link in with this series, which you may not have heard about. In 1978, A Child's Voice. Does anyone remember this? Little half-hour film starring the brilliant Irish actor T.P. McKenna. It was directed by Kieran Hickey, and it was written, fact fans, by David Thompson of Biographical Dictionary of Film fame, his solo screenwriting credit, I believe. It's very, very effective about this radio host who tells ghost stories, and then he starts receiving these calls from this little boy saying, I don't like this story, can you stop telling it, please? Scared the bejesus out of me when I was a kid. I'm going to leave a link to it below so you can watch it on YouTube. And another little one that you may not have heard of, another M.R. James adaptation, Mr. Humphreys and His Inheritance, which was shown as part of a schools programme in the 1970s, an adaptation of M.R. James, and it's quite gruesome. It's only about a quarter of an hour long. I'll leave a little link to that as well. But let's get into the ranking. Now, at number 10 is The Ash Tree. This was the last of the 5 M.R. James adaptations made by Lawrence Gordon Clark, and it's my least favourite by quite a long way. And the problem with The Ash Tree is it looks beautiful, gorgeous location, Lalla Ward from Doctor Who is in it. The problem is it's written by David Rudkin. Now, that name may be familiar to some people. He was the writer of Penda's Fen and Artemis 81, an infamous cult writer on British television who made really weirdy-beardy, psychedelic folk horror films, of which I'm extremely fond. I've talked about Penda's Fen before on this channel. But Rudkin's style of writing and mythologising and Lawrence Gordon Clark's simple, pithy ghost storytelling don't go together. It's a queasy mix. And I never really liked the original M.R. James story, if I'm honest. I'm a huge M.R. James fan. But the Ash Tree is the one with the spiders, that come out of the tree at the end. It didn't really work for me. So this is my least favourite of the BBC Ghost Stories for Christmas. I don't find it very scary or very interesting, really. At number 9 is Stigma. Now, what happened was, Lawrence Gordon Clark had done 5 M.R. James adaptations. They did an adaptation of Dickens. Those are the beloved ones that we remember. And then I think there was an imperative to try something modern. So he made a modern story set in the modern world, starring Peter Bowles of all people. And I was discussing this one with a friend of mine recently, and we were both saying, too much nudity. Good God, too many tits. Peter Bowles and tits, it's not right. But, it seems that Lawrence Gordon Clark makes the classic mistake of thinking that to modernise it and to make it more adult, he has to put loads of gratuitous nudity and blood into it. It doesn't need it. The story is atmospheric and interesting enough as it is, but that's the road that Gordon Clark goes down, and it's rather unpleasant. It's atmospheric, it's very well made, it's very well acted, but it's just unpleasant, and I don't really understand why. The second of the modern ghost stories, which finished the run, The Ice House, comes in at number 8. Now, most people don't like this one, and it's got a very different atmosphere and tone to the rest of the series. It's a black comedy, a weird comedy set in this kind of retreat in the country, where people are sort of being disappeared, and the protagonist finds out that they're being sort of frozen. It's very odd. It's a very strange film. The reason why I put it above Stigma and The Ash Tree is one image. The image at the end, I don't know if you remember this, where the man accepts his fate and he stands by the door of the ice house where he'll be frozen in perpetuity, looking back. That image stayed with me from childhood. I've never forgotten it. I've watched it as an adult and the story doesn't have anywhere near as much impact, but that image is frozen in my mind and really still to this day unsettles me. So check out The Ice House again if you've not seen it but for a long time. It's quite interesting. It's very odd. Doesn't really fit in with the rest of the series, but interesting. Okay, those are the 3 ones that don't quite work, but the other 7 are beautiful, perfect pieces of TV drama. Now, at number 7, people will be upset with me for this, but I'm going to put Lost Hearts. This was the 3rd of Lawrence Gordon Clark's adaptations of M.R. James, and I know this is a very special cult item for many people of my generation and older. It's the one with the 2 eerie kids with the long fingernails playing that balalaika thing. You remember? I love it. It's beautifully made. Clark's direction, the use of the location is wonderful. It loses a few points because the uncle figure I don't think is very well played. I think the acting is a bit broad. And these plays rely so much on the actors. And the kids never scared me as much as the sort of weird ghouls coming after these librarians and historians and the other M.R. James tales. But it is very atmospheric, and I can see why it's a special film to so many people. In 6th place, The Treasure of Abbot Thomas. Oh my God, you remember this one, the one with the slime monster. As a kid, this was absolutely terrifying. Brilliant atmosphere, brilliant use of location, and the wonderful, wonderful Michael Bryant. Just a little aside on Michael Bryant. When I first came to London, I went to see lots of theatre, and I went to see lots of Shakespeare adaptations. And I saw many of the great and good actors of the land doing Shakespeare. No one was better than Michael Bryant. the single best stage actor I've ever seen. Sometimes on television, Michael Bryant, who's also in the Stone Tape, he seems a bit florid, as English stage actors sometimes do on TV and film. They seem a bit over the top. But if you see him on stage, he was electric. I remember seeing him in Richard II, and by that time he was huge. He was Orson Welles fat, so he couldn't move very much. He came on the centre of the stage, started speaking. The whole audience, you could hear a pin drop. Incredible. And he makes The Treasure of Abbot Thomas. He's brilliant. He sells the script, he sells the dialogue. It just, just purrs. This is great fun. It's probably the simplest of the M.R. James adaptations in some ways, but The Slime Monster is fab. Love it. Fifth place is Shalkan the Painter. Some of you may not have heard of this. This was an attempt to revive the series in 1978 by Leslie Megahy. Very strange. Let's not forget this was made for a BBC Arts programme. It's an adaptation of a story by Sheridan Le Fanu about a painter during the high point of Dutch painting in the 1600s. And this young painter, he gets involved with his master's daughter, but then this weird ghoul-like man comes and pays a dowry for the daughter and takes her away. Is he dead? Is he a spirit? Is he a ghoul? It's a bizarre film. Being an arts programme, Megahy was as much interested in making a comment on Dutch art as he was on telling a ghost story. And he went to some lengths with his production designer and his cinematographer to recreate the style of Dutch painting, the composition, the colours, the light. It's a beautiful looking film. It's gorgeous. Obviously spent a great deal of care on it. The cinematography is immaculate. The light, the graininess of the light in these dark rooms is beautifully done. But then it's mixed with this bizarre, rather lurid story of a young woman being taken away to be possessed by a ghoul. And at the end, the young painter sees her cavorting in bed with this old, decaying man. And there's lots of lurid nudity. There were strange things going on in the BBC in the 70s. It's a one-off. If you've never seen it, do watch it. I think it's extraordinary. I've never seen anything quite like it. Now the revered, hallowed greats of the BBC Ghost Story. In fourth place, A Warning to the Curious. This was never my favourite M.R. James story, but it's a great TV film. At the centre of it is Peter Vaughan and Clive Swift, who are perfectly cast. One is an amateur working-class archaeologist, and the other is a sort of middle-class writer or tourist that he meets in this, grim, blasted Norfolk seaside resort. That sort of slight idea of class difference runs through the story and is perfectly pitched. In a modern BBC drama written by Gatiss, it'd be stuffed in your face. But here it's just left as a beautiful undertone. This is a high watermark of Lawrence Gordon Clark's direction. His use of the Norfolk scenery, the beaches, is incredible. The story itself is not that interesting, actually, but the way it's filmed is so evocative and atmospheric. I absolutely love it. That shot when he goes to the hotel room at night and the camera seems to pan around the room, and then just in the half light, you see the ghoul's face start to look up and the scream. Wonderful. Absolutely amazing. In third place, The Stalls of Barchester. I think this was the first of Lawrence Gordon Clark's adaptations. I watched it again over Christmas and I was struck again by how perfect it is. After watching Gatiss's lame effort, it's just so perfect. It's so effortless. The casting of Robert Hardy is perfect. The choice of locations, both interior and exterior, is perfect. The attention to detail. Making ghostly, shocking scenes is not that difficult. But making ghostly scenes out of seemingly nothing, but they stay in your mind. There's a scene in this film where Robert Hardy comes out of his door and he sees a figure just go past him. His butler comes up. He says, "Was that you?" And the butler says, "No, I've been downstairs." So Robert Hardy takes the candlelight and he moves down the corridor and he lights up the niche at the end of the corridor and there's nothing there. That's it. We're not talking about a complex effect. The rightness of the image, the editing, the way that alcove looks in the candlelight is everything. It's so perfectly done. The BBC knew how to do that stuff in those days. The exposition scene, the info dump scene that you get in all horror films when you're told what's going on, is two old men walking around this very ancient grove of trees with a lake, and the snow is lightly falling. It's so evocative. It's so right. And they're so full of details that I didn't even notice. The last shot with the opening, the closing credits, I never noticed the cat and the significance of the cat. You know, this is a perfect piece. I think it's 50 minutes, a perfect short horror film. It simply can't be beaten. It still scares me to this day. And there's also lashings of wit and humour in it, if you wish to look. Like, you know, the rector, you know, character. Or is it the verger character? Brilliant. In second place, my absolute favourite of the Lawrence Gordon Clarks is The Signalman, his Charles Dickens adaptation. This is a precise 30-minute masterpiece. It is, I cannot find any fault in it. This brilliant story of this signalman in his lonely signalman's hut near this tunnel, and he keeps seeing this spectre waving at him from the tunnel. A seeming premonition of disaster. I remember seeing this when I was a kid in the 70s, absolutely terrified of it. I still marvel at Denholm Ellion's performance. Here it is, a little half-hour ghost story on the BBC. His performance is immaculate. It's so right and it's so powerful, and it moves you in mysterious ways. Like that moment, I don't know if you remember, when he's looking down, his visitor to the signal hut has fallen asleep, and Denholm Elliot is looking at him in the candlelight and the light from the fire and says, "It doesn't matter if you fall asleep. There's no responsibility on your shoulders." It's the eeriest moment in the whole half hour. Brilliantly acted by Denholm Elliot. I cannot praise The Signalman enough. I think it's one of the best British horror films ever made. But it's still not number one. Number one is Whistle and I'll Come to You by Jonathan Miller. Even Martin Scorsese picks this as one of his favourite British films. It's so perfect. Now, I noticed that some people have criticised this film for its humour, but if you go back and read the original M.R. James story, the original protagonist of the M.R. James story is a bit of a fool, and there is a sense of humour throughout the story. So it's not really beyond the pale for Jonathan Miller to pick up on that. And there's a lot of humour here, and at the centre of it is Michael Hordern's extraordinary performance as this sort of, you know, bumbling, absent-minded professor character who's bitten off more than he can chew and is being followed by something that he doesn't understand, that he only really comprehends in his subconscious, in his dreams. And the idea, this sort of subtext that Jonathan Miller brings in, that this is a man who is not so much facing a ghoul, but is facing his own deterioration of mind, his own senility, and that incredible ending. You know, you have that sort of schoolboy effect of the sheets getting up off the bed, though it still works because of the power and the atmosphere that Jonathan Miller has invested. And then you cut to Michael Hordern sucking his thumb, reduced to childhood again, as so many people are in senility. And then that shot of him saying, "Oh no, oh no," freeze frame. I remember it so vividly from my childhood. And the most powerful evocations of someone unable to confront the truth of their own deterioration, the truth of their own facing up to something, all their beliefs, all their certainties crumbling in front of them. It's so powerful. And it all happens in about 50 minutes with lashings of humour. Where did the talent for making that kind of television go? That's my ranking. I'd love to know your ranking below. I love talking about the BBC Ghost Stories for Christmas. I've loved them ever since I was a kid, and I love them just as much now. And as I'll just quick plug, if you haven't got the BFI's 2 volumes, they are full of extras, and they look as beautiful as ever. Thanks very much.